National Council of Raza.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm the cleanup woman. I joked before that I was going to take notes on what wasn't said and what was said. I'll just do a big ditto to lots of the things I said, and then add the unique perspective of English language learners. I want to change the title, which is the impact of standards alignment and increasing rigor on ELLs, to the impact of not aligning standards and increasing rigor for English language learners, because that's what we face today. You know, we at National Council of La Raza are not only behind high standards and excellent assessments for our students, we consider it a civil rights issue. Much like Westland talked about the notion of Latino and African American students not getting access to high standards and that becoming a civil rights issue for her, it's a major civil rights issue for us. In the 1970s, there was a Supreme Court ruling that said that English language learners had the right to access the same course content that all students did, and schools had an obligation to do that. That was a Supreme Court ruling. Around 30 years later with NCLB, we began to see the real implementation of that, where schools were required to break out achievement scores for English language learners. Until then, there'd been a lot of fuzzy accountability for how English language learners were doing in schools. A lot of what we call pobrecito syndrome, or you poor thing, you don't speak English, so I'm not going to give you these hard courses, or you poor thing, you don't speak English, you're not going to go to college, let me help you get a job. NCLB and the requirement for accountability for all groups was a major milestone for English language learners, and is a major milestone that isn't quite achieved yet. So I want to talk about today, in the probably 4 minutes I have left, what some strategies we want to push our. But before that, I want to remind us about why this is important to us. It's going to be a tremendous amount of effort, so we have to know what's in it for us. It's going to be a tremendous amount of effort in the schools and for teachers and for school boards to make sure that English language learners not only have access to the same high standards, but actually achieve the same high standards as all kids. So why? I think there's a historical notion for it. We want to overcome that history, that poor history of achievement for English language learners. But the bigger imperative is the demographics. Just this morning I received over email a summary of the findings from the Pew Center for Hispanic Studies, looking at the census and the latest data. And what we find is since 2000, Hispanics account for over half of the population growth in this country. Over half of the population growth since 2000. When we talk about English language learners, we're not talking about Hispanics, we're talking about several other groups. But when you look at the Hispanic population, 40% of that population are English language learners in our schools, or have been at some point. So when you look at that continued growth of the Hispanic population, it signals a continued growth in the number of English language learners in our schools. And that's why it's important, because going forward, if we're not educating this population to the highest standards, we're failing a huge proportion of our students. If you live in Los Angeles, if you live in New York City, if you live in Dalton, Georgia, if you're not raising standards for your English language learners and making sure you're achieving it, you're missing out on, in some cases, 60% of your students. So this matters to us going forward. I'm going to focus today on the federal perspective. There are lots of state efforts going on, and they need to continue. There are a lot of local efforts going on, and they need to continue. But what I have found in my long history of working with English language learners is, however important local efforts are and however important state efforts are, they remain sometimes islands of excellence, and we have lots of states and lots of localities that don't have in place the policies and don't have in place the practices to work with English language learners. And so we need to take a federal perspective in looking at these students and take federal action in looking at these students. So this is a good time. We are going into a new administration. We are going into a new congressional session. We have the greatest opportunity now to look at No Child Left Behind, look at ESEA, I'll call it that instead of No Child Left Behind, that might be less politically charged, and look at how English language learners have been served by this law and what kind of changes we need to make to the law and what we need to make sure stays in place.